The 1950s were a very important decade for the U.S. for many reasons.
There was a lot of political debate in the 50s, whether we should have been involved in the Korean War, Eisenhower's election, the Second Red Scare, and many more.
The Korean War was a war fought on the 38th parallel on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. stepped in to aid South Korea after they pleaded for help against the North Koreans and the Soviet Union.
General MacArthur had led the Americans and South Koreans to succeed in recapturing the South Korean capital of Seoul. They wanted to keep the Koreans in their place by dropping the atomic bomb on them.
Truman declined the request and had MacArthur discharged instead. The war reached a year-long stalemate and no real advancements had been made. 2 years were spent fighting in a foreign country and tens of thousands of Americans were killed.
This left politicians angry with Truman for not taking the means necessary for ending the conflict with the atomic bomb, or even getting involved in the first place.
America was in need of a president and an election was just around the bend, the election of 1952. This election was one to remember. The presidential office had been held by Democrats since 1932, throughout the Great Depression and the entirety of World War II. Dwight D. Eisenhower quickly gained the vote of the people and destroyed the Democratic Party. For the first time in 20 years, a Republican was voted into office. Shortly after his election, Eisenhower visited Korea himself and concluded, "We could not stand forever on a static front and continue to accept casualties without any visible results. Small attacks on small hills would not end this war." So he brought about an armistice, and the war ended.
Eisenhower also came up with the interstate highway system, which was a new, more efficient way of transportation routes for people to get where they wanted to quickly.
During the time of the Cold War, the scare of communist spies swept across America. Citizens were afraid that spies from the Soviet Union were in the U.S., and many accusations were made.
This was known as the Second Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy started the belief of McCarthyism, which accused people of being spies without legitimate reason or evidence. The 50s were booming with babies.
Due to the American surge for normalcy after many years of war and the Great Depression, young adults were seeking to start families. Americans were sure that the future was safe, so many households were growing nationwide. Along with the baby boom, a huge movement to the suburbs rushed across America. Because families were growing, many had the idea of living in an affordable home just outside the city and still having all of the benefits. These homes were much more suitable for families filled with fun times, laughter, and mostly music.
Music was very influential during this time period. African Americans were still largely migrating to the north for more industrial jobs and brought R&B and jazz with them. The musical style of R&B, after some time, developed into rock and roll. The first rock songs were created, and although the genre was first hated by the public, it soon became the signature sound of the 50s. Also, records were advancing. With the use of the 45 singles and the 33 RPM records, they could hold more songs with better quality. Many new artists made their break during this time of musical advancement. Some impactful artists include Frank Sinatra, Elvis, Johnny Cash. Many songs from the 50s are still played around the world today. Along with music, there were many technological advances. Record players became very common in homes, blasting the music of the times.
Television was majorly popularized in the 50s. Due to civilians' sense of conformity in the 50s and the economic boom following World War II, they were able to settle down and watch television for the first time since its invention in 1927.
Broadcasting was a huge industry, some of the most popular broadcasts being I Love Lucy, Bonanza, and Father Knows Best. Due to the boom in television sales, advertisements became widely used as well, which helped increase business sales.
See your Ford dealer soon.
From musicians and actors to politicians and rioters, the 50s were home to several influential people, one of them being Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
Born January 8, 1935, Elvis was deemed for greatness. With his unique voice and lyrics, Elvis is seen as the most influential person to rock and roll and maybe music altogether.
Elvis's music changed the way all races listened to music. Before, white youth Americans didn't know the styles of R&B, blues, and rock and roll. But Elvis spread these styles in his music and enlightened many. His talent went beyond just singing. He starred in 33 major films as well.
Elvis is undoubtedly one of the most important musicians, but he's only one of the many influential people in the 50s, one of these people being Jackie Robinson.
Next batter, Moose Skowron. The Moose grounds one to short. Lumpy is forced, but Berra scores, and the Yankees tie the score. Which comes in the ninth after Turley has yielded only 2 hits. Red Schoendienst lifts a long fly, an easy out, and the World Series is over. For the 18th time in 24 World Series, the New York Yankees are once again the champions.
Put me in cold, I'm ready to play today.
The sport of baseball was greatly affected by the long-lasting problem of segregation. Jackie Robinson made his debut as the first professional African-American baseball player, making great strides in Negro and MLB baseball. The evolution of America's greatest pastime, baseball, has brought about franchises that began forming. One of these franchises made a fight to get to the top during the 1950s, the New York Yankees. The Yankees won the World Series 6 times in the 50s. These included 1950, 51, 52, 53, 56, and 1958. Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Well, now that you're here, let's talk about literature. The 50s are known as the English literature's angry decade. Anger produced many new kinds of literature involving the movement in poetry with Philip Larkin and Tom Gunn, to the introduction of fiction with Kingsley Amis, and the plays that were so-called angry young men. Literature had taken a turn from its previous reluctance in theaters and movies.
Some of the most popular books were Charlotte's Web, Lord of the Flies, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Fahrenheit 451. Dr. Seuss made his debut with The Cat in the Hat.
The 1950s were an important time for women's rights. During the war, women were expected to leave their initial duties as housewives to provide for the family as the men of the house would. When the men came back after the war, some women didn't want to slow down in the work environment. There was an increasing number of women working in the 1950s. While most women did not work above assembly lines and service jobs, they began finding their place in occupational living.
Segregation caused many arising conflicts between minorities and white Americans. These minorities migrated to America in hope of a new life, including getting jobs. With an increase in competition for these jobs, many white Americans were worried that the immigrants would take their jobs. Segregation swept across the nation. Everywhere you went, there were labels determining if a black man could enter a certain building. The nation was divided as schools and work facilities were segregated.
This serious increase in segregated communities only meant minorities were going to be forced to fight for their rights. Influential movements like Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat for a white businessman during the Montgomery bus boycott sent a rippling effect throughout black communities. These certain actions led to changes in the fight for rights.
The civil rights movement played a major role in the 50s. Beginning in 1954, when the court case Brown v. Education was held, this powerful movement granted rights to African Americans who were fighting against segregation. This Supreme Court case rules towards Linda Brown, an African American woman who was denied entrance to all white schools in Topeka, and ended racial segregation in public schools, although most schools ignored this. Following this court case, just a year later, a teenage boy, Emmett Till, was maliciously murdered in the state of Mississippi for supposedly flirting with a white woman. In 1955, Rosa Parks began the Montgomery bus boycott by refusing her seat to a white man. Courageous acts like these are what propelled the civil rights movement into action. Later, in 1957, a group of 9 African American students attending the high school Little Rock Central, which was segregated, were prevented from entering the school. The school was guarded by the Arkansas National Guard. After 18 days, the students again returned, guarded by U.S. soldiers, and they were allowed entrance, and they completed their school year, but were accompanied by continuous harassment and neglect from their peers and even teachers. These issues only sparked the beginning of the civil rights movement and pushed on until 1968, where the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed. There were many aggressive movements and even wars in the 50s. The Cold War, although sounding vicious and deadly, was not one of these.
Aggressive through verbal threats and acts of containment, the Cold War lasted for about 45 years. The Cold War, meaning a war without military fight, lasted from the end of the Second World War to the conclusion of the Soviet Union in 1991.
The war was between communist powers and countries trying to stop it, so basically US versus Russia.
The U.S. wanted to contain communism because it went against all ideas of liberty. The Soviet Union wanted to spread communism to the world.
The war consisted of nuclear threats, the space race, and the race to be the largest world superpower.
So overall, the 50s were a time for rebuilding culture and ideas while maintaining the American dream.